Hello and welcome to your online weaning workshop. This is the first part in your online weaning course with the Lunar Hive, where you have access to various different resources and video clips every week for 8 weeks to help guide you through the weaning process. My name is Catherine Lipp and I am a registered nutritionist specialising in paediatric and maternal nutrition. And I will be taking you through the weaning course, and you will have access to all of my clips and resources as well as this online workshop. You also are able to contact me for additional follow-up support if you want to throughout the course. I often find that the questions parents have before they start weaning are quite different to those that they have as they get going and as they move further forward through the process. So please do feel free to contact me at any point after you have done the course until your baby turns 12 months if you have specific questions that you want to ask me. So let's get started with this online workshop first, and you do have these slides available to download, so you can pause this video now and download the slides, print them if you want to, and have those as your notes to add to as we go through, or you can download them afterwards. And as this is a recorded video, you have lifetime access and you can come back to this at any point. So the things that I'm going to take you through as part of the webinar today are listed here. We're going to talk about everything from when you should start introducing foods to first foods, what are the best ones to start with, any foods to avoid. We'll talk about baby-led weaning, and we'll talk a little bit about mealtime routine. So I'll take you through some kind of rough menu planners to help give you a little bit of guidance in terms of that mealtime routine, portion sizes, and kind of top tips for weaning, as well as a little bit on drinks and vitamin drops too. So you may already be aware, you may have heard from your health visitor or your GP, or you may have read about the guidance around when we should start introducing solid food. And the current guidance from the Department of Health, based on a wealth of evidence and research, suggests that we should start introducing solid foods around about 6 months. And that word around is quite strategic to recognise the fact that all babies are different, and some babies will be ready to start introducing solid foods earlier than others. And the reason behind all of this evidence, behind these guidelines, is because we know that babies will get everything that they need to meet their full growth potential, both physically and cognitively, from milk alone for the first 6 months of life. So whether that's breast milk or formula milk or a mixture of the two, providing your baby is full term, is healthy, is feeding well with their milk feeds, there's no reason why they should need additional nutrition from solid foods before 6 months. For some babies who do start weaning a little bit earlier, the guidance around the absolute earliest age to start introducing solid food is around 17 weeks or 4 months. So we certainly wouldn't recommend introducing anything before 17 weeks or 4 months. And the ideal age is around about 6 months. You'll hear me using the term weaning a lot, and weaning workshops are something that I've been doing for years and years through NHS roles and Public Health England, and it's a very well used and well recognised terminology, but we are starting to hear more of the words complementary feeding or sometimes introducing solid foods, and the idea around moving on to this new terminology of complementary feeding or introducing solid foods and using the term weaning less is because we don't want to give the impression that we are weaning off milk and onto solid food. So particularly at the start of the process, weaning is really about complementing the milk diet with some solid food. And so we're not really reducing the amount of milk that you're giving your baby initially, but we are complementing that milk feed with some solid food, and we'll come on to more about how to do that as we go through the course. But if you hear the term complementary feeding or introducing solid foods rather than weaning, then that's the reason why. So in terms of when to start, the idea is that we don't want to do it too soon. Why don't we want to do it too soon? Well, for babies who are quite young, their gut, their kidneys, their digestive system, their immune system, it isn't as well developed in a younger baby compared to a 6-month-old baby. So a 6-month-old baby has had more time to mature. Their gut particularly has had a chance to what we call colonize a little more. And this prepares them well for accepting solid food. So with babies who are introduced to solid foods too young, we may see more risk of tummy upsets, things like constipation or diarrhea. We may also see more risk of infection. The risk of choking really comes if the baby is quite little and hasn't got good head and neck support, and therefore is kind of, their head is flopping, and they're not physically able to take food off the spoon and swallow it efficiently. So there may be more of a risk of choking there. So as we get closer to 6 months, all of these things develop, mature, colonize, and that does put baby in a good position to start accepting solid food with little issue. On the opposite end of the scale, we don't want to introduce solid foods too late either. And sometimes parents will say to me at weaning workshops or at our consultations that they are going on holiday when their baby turns 6 months, or baby's not very well, and they just want to leave it another couple of weeks until they know their baby is going to be well settled, and they've got more time and focus and energy to deal with it. The difficulty with doing that is that we know babies will receive everything that they need to meet their growth potential up until 6 months from just the milk. But after 6 months, the milk alone isn't always enough. And particularly in the case of something like iron, we may see iron deficiency, or risk of iron deficiency is increased in babies who don't start weaning until beyond 6 months. And that's because the iron stores that babies take from the mother during pregnancy are usually enough to last them the first 6 months of life. They store iron in their liver, but after that first 6 months, those iron stores are starting to deplete. So we do want to use weaning or complementary feeding to top up on some of those nutrient stores, and iron is the key one that we're interested in when it comes to weaning and that the second half of infancy. You may also find that babies who are weaned too late start to become a little bit fussy. They're a bit set in their ways, perhaps. They may start to refuse lumpy foods. It's difficult to move them on through the stages, and they may have difficulty adapting to things like family foods and taking food off the spoon, or adapting to finger foods later on as well. So if you like, there's kind of a window of opportunity for introducing solid foods to your baby, and it's not too early, it's not too late, and it's somewhere around about 6 months. And every baby is different, so it will vary depending on gestational age. It will vary depending on signs and signals from your baby as well, and how well they are growing and eating and taking milk food. So every baby does need to be treated as an individual. And I always say to parents in my weaning workshops that my role is really to tell you what the guidelines are, and the reason behind those guidelines, so the evidence and the research. But actually it's your decision as to when you feel is right for your baby. And hopefully by doing something like this weaning workshop, you will get a better understanding of those guidelines and the reasons behind it, and you'll feel more empowered to make that decision that you feel is right for your baby. So there are some key signs to look out for, and this is what I would encourage you to focus on, bearing in mind those guidelines that we've talked about. The key signs that you are looking for with your baby are that they can sit up with good head and neck control. Now, a 6-month-old baby may not be able to sit completely unaided. They may need some support still at 6 months, but you're looking that they can at least hold their head up and they have that good head and neck control. We're also looking for good hand-eye coordination. So you want your baby to be able to reach out, pick food up and move it to their mouth, and be able to have the coordination to do that. And then the other thing that we're looking for is that they are actually able to swallow that food as well. So they know what to do with it, and they're able to put them in their mouth, and more food goes in than gets spat back out again. And it is very normal for babies to spit food out, and particularly at first when it's quite a new experience and a new technique that they're learning, you will see them use their tongue to push food in and out, and that's something that is more prominent in younger babies. But quite quickly we want to see that they are able to take in more of that food than they are pushing out. So if you are noticing a combination of these signs and your baby is somewhere close to 6 months, then you may decide that that's the right time for them to start weaning. But those signs are the really key things to focus on. Lots of parents may also comment or notice that baby is paying a real interest in food. So they may really watch you eating, they might watch the food go from your plate to your mouth, and they might even mimic your kind of chewing action with their mouth. And these are all really good signs that your baby is interested. They notice that you're doing something different and they're recognizing that. Individually, one of these signs alone is kind of not enough to make us feel that they are ready. You're looking for a combination of these signs, and some of these signs, particularly the showing an interest in food or reaching out and grabbing objects and putting them into their mouth, may happen actually quite a bit earlier than 6 months. So don't feel rushed as soon as you start to notice one or two of these things that your baby is ready to start. Take your time, bear in mind that the guidance is around about 6 months, and look for a combination of those things to decide what's right for you and for your baby. In terms of equipment, there's lots of different things that you can buy. You could spend a fortune on weaning equipment. Not all of it is necessary, and a lot of it comes down to personal preference. My key tips when it comes to something like equipment is making sure that it's something that is wipe clean. Weaning can be really messy, and I would encourage you to embrace the mess as much as possible if you can. Weaning is just as much about playing with the food, seeing the food, smelling the food, touching the food, and really enjoying that process for your baby. It's not just about how much goes in and comes out the other end. So if you can take precautions against the mess, wipe clean bibs, wipe clean high chairs, maybe a splash mat underneath the floor, all of those things might help you to feel a little bit more relaxed. And able for your baby to kind of explore and play and get their hands stuck in as well. So anything that allows you to do that is a good thing. As part of week 1 of your weaning course, there is a download which talks about different types of equipment, so that might give you a little bit more idea about some of the equipment that's out there, and some advantages and disadvantages of different things. But as I say, most of it comes down to personal preference, so shop around, explore, decide what you think is right for you, and if you have any specific questions, then please do get in touch around the equipment. Moving on to talking about the suitable first foods for your baby, there's a lot of evidence that focuses on introducing green vegetables as baby's first food. And the reason for this is because green vegetables have quite a bitter flavour. And that's a flavour that baby's not really used to so far. And it's also a flavour that we are naturally quite wary of. We are all born with an innate preference towards sweet tasting foods, and that tends to be due to this kind of survival mechanism that sweet tasting foods are safe, and they tend to be higher in calories and therefore perhaps better for survival. The bitter tasting foods, however, may be more likely to be toxic or poisonous, and we're talking about kind of take us way back to hunter-gatherer times. These things may have been the case back then, and so an innate response is to be quite wary and quite cautious of these types of flavours. So for babies, it's really important that we get them used to these more bitter flavours and feel comfortable and learn to enjoy these bitter flavours early on. And a lot of the research shows that if we can get them used to more bitter tasting foods in the first few weeks of weaning, they are more likely to accept not just vegetables and other bitter tasting foods, but any new food that we offer them within that first few years of life. So potentially for the first few years, you have a better chance of having a good eater if you have started to introduce bitter tasting foods in the first couple of weeks of weaning. And really good examples of bitter tasting foods are those green vegetables. So things like broccoli, spinach, cabbage, green beans, kale, avocado, courgette, runner beans. All of those vegetables tend to be more of the bitter flavours. And what I would suggest is starting with those different vegetables and doing one thing on its own so they get used to that pure flavour on its own for the first couple of weeks. And you can do something different every day. That's a question that I get asked a lot by parents, is do I need to do the same food for several days in a row to make sure that they're okay with it and there's no reaction? But actually it's fine to introduce something different every day. And if they're going to have a reaction to it, if it's an allergy, then chances are they will react relatively quickly to that food. And it is quite rare to have an allergic reaction to a vegetable. So I don't want to panic you or worry you about allergies, and we will talk more about it later on. But trying something different every day is absolutely fine, and it's a good way of getting lots of variety and different flavours in there in the first couple of weeks. So my advice would be to start on green vegetables and try something different every day. Ideally try single flavoured vegetables initially. Then you could move on to other foods, so things like the sweeter tasting vegetables: carrots, parsnip, butternut squash, swede, pumpkin, sweet potato. All of those things are all perfectly suitable weaning foods as well. But because they do taste sweeter, we want to try and focus on more of the bitter ones as the first few tastes for the first couple of weeks if we can. Something like baby rice or baby porridges, potato, other kind of starchy foods are all perfectly suitable first foods as well for your baby. But again, because they're not particularly bitter, we perhaps want to introduce this as we expand the variety and after we've introduced those green vegetables first thing. Things like mashed lentils, beans and pulses, they're also really good first weaning foods, and these ones tend to be higher in iron and also protein as well. And remember, we were talking about iron earlier on, so they are good ones to introduce to boost those iron levels a little bit more at this point. Fruits are on there too, and you'll see that strategically I've put fruits at the bottom of this slide, and that is a little bit strategic because again, fruits are those kind of sweeter tasting foods, so they contain natural sugars. They are all perfectly healthy, perfectly suitable weaning foods, but because of the natural sugars, they do naturally taste quite sweet. And if we introduce too many sweet foods early on, you may find that your baby is a little bit resistant when we do come to something like vegetables, particularly the bitter flavoured vegetables. So although they are fine to introduce as soon as you start weaning, I would say get those green vegetables done first, a good couple of weeks of those before you gradually start to introduce any of the more sweeter flavours. And to show you some examples of what those foods might look like in terms of texture, there's some pictures here which will talk you through that. And actually, again, in the first week of your online weaning course, there is a really handy download which is almost like a checklist of different foods. So it will give you some ideas, hopefully, and some inspiration of some of those green vegetables that you can try, but also other foods as well that you can kind of tick off, because we really want to focus on that variety within the first few weeks and months of weaning. So you can use that kind of first foods checklist as a bit of a guide to help you make sure you're getting lots of different variety in there. But do try and focus on those green vegetables if you can for the first 2 weeks at least. And so again, in terms of texture, you'll see that strategically, again, I have chosen green vegetables for these pictures just to really drive that message home. But the texture, there's no real right or wrong with texture. You might start off with something that's quite smooth and that's much more of a kind of smooth puree. Something that is mashed might look a little bit more like this middle one here. And then you've got finger foods as well. So it's entirely up to you what sort of texture you start with. Most of the time parents feel more comfortable going for something that's slightly smoother initially and then moving through the stages. However, if you feel that your baby is quite capable and able and interested and willing to try something that's a little bit lumpier and mashed, or going straight in with finger foods with something like baby-led weaning, which we'll talk about more later on, then that's absolutely fine to do too. And it really is about what kind of suits your baby and what you feel they are capable of doing. Essentially, we want to move through these textures as soon as your baby is developmentally ready. So again, this is where for a 6-month-old baby, they're probably much more capable of coping with the mash textures or with finger foods compared to a baby who might have started weaning a little bit earlier. So it might really depend on what age you started. It might also depend on your kind of baby's developmental stage and how they are developing with that. But if you do start on something that's quite smooth, I would say try to progress onto the thicker purees and a little bit more mashed food as soon as you feel that they are ready for that, because again, that puts them in good stead for dealing with a wider variety of foods, and you get less fussiness the sooner that we can move through these stages. A few more examples here. We have green beans and courgette. So again, you can see how the textures might vary, and it does depend a little bit on actually what the vegetable is. So with something like courgette, there's quite a lot of texture in even this first picture here, and this will require them to do a little bit more work with their mouth and their tongue and their jaw. But as soon as you feel ready, you feel that baby is ready to do that, then that's a good thing to push them onto. Staying on a really smooth texture for too long, again, can just make them a little bit set in their ways. These textures are really easy for them to just kind of swallow down with very little effort. And although that might be great for getting lots of food in, it's not really getting them used to the idea of biting and chewing and swallowing and getting those muscles going, which is really important for not just their feeding technique, but also for their speech and language development later on as well. So do have a think about what you feel is right for your baby in terms of their texture, and remember not to stay on a smooth texture for too long. And this next slide here quite nicely shows what you might expect, particularly with these green vegetables. This is what we call the disgust face, and this is really normal to expect with babies. So don't be alarmed if you see a lot of this disgust face the whole way through the weaning process, not necessarily just at the start. And it might be particularly common with a lot of those green vegetables. Remember, your baby's never really experienced these foods before, and particularly those bitter ones, they might be quite wary of. So the disgust face doesn't necessarily mean that they don't like it. It might just mean more that they're a bit unsure, they're not really familiar with this food, they don't really know what to do with it. It's a very new flavour. So try not to let that put you off trying these foods again. It's very normal to expect this kind of reaction. And again, a lot of the research suggests that repeated exposure is absolutely key for encouraging your baby to enjoy the foods. We have a real opportunity during weaning to kind of develop and mould their taste preferences, and so they don't really have any likes or dislikes at this stage. It's more about what we expose them to and how we make them feel around those foods. So even if you've tried something like broccoli 5, 6, maybe even 10 times, and your baby has refused it and shown you this lovely disgust face, don't worry, it's very normal. Keep trying. So you might leave it a few days or maybe even a week and then try it a little bit later on. Try to do it relatively regularly. Try to also make eye contact with your baby when you're feeding them, smile, try and feel relaxed and comfortable, and dedicate a bit of time to the mealtime so that they don't feel too rushed or under pressure. And all of those things will just reassure your baby and make them feel a little bit more comfortable and a little bit more willing to try. But it really is about not giving up and keep persevering with some of these tastes, even if you are repeatedly getting this disgust face here. So in terms of foods to avoid for your baby, actually beyond 6 months, there aren't very many foods that your baby can't have, and they might be more obvious things like added salt, added sugar. Honey is not suitable until 12 months, and the reason for that is because honey contains a type of bacteria which can cause infant botulism, a type of food poisoning. So if you buy a jar of honey, you'll always see it says on the label, not suitable for infants under 12 months, and that's the reason explain why. But also it does just taste very sweet, and remember that these sweet tasting foods are not something that we want to encourage, so it's best to avoid sweet tasting foods and also the salty foods for as long as you can. Hot chilies or hot spices may cause a bit of tummy upset and a bit of aggravation. You might get some fruity nappies, so try to avoid those ones as well until beyond a year. Something like unpasteurized cheeses, or the shark, swordfish and marlin. This is all similar advice to what you might have heard during pregnancy. And with the fishes, because they are larger fish, higher up the food chain, they have accumulated more kind of pollutants and mercury, so they are unsuitable for babies' little systems. Not that I have met anyone who started introducing their baby to shark, swordfish or marlin particularly early, but it's there for you anyway, based on all the kind of policy advice from Department of Health. So those are the foods to avoid until 12 months. There are also some foods to consider how often we give them. So something like liver is a really good source of iron, but it's also incredibly high in vitamin A. So liver, although it is suitable from 6 months, it shouldn't be offered more than once a week and in quite small quantities. Again, I don't meet many people who start introducing their baby to liver very early, but just one to be aware of. And again, with oily fish is really useful, particularly for the omega-3 fatty acids. So a great thing to try and get your babies used to later on in the weaning process. And the omega-3 fatty acids are a really good source of the omega-3 fatty acids can really help with babies' brain development, their cognitive development, and also the development of their eyes as well. So a nice thing to introduce, but the advice is with those types of fish is to give them no more than twice a week. And that goes throughout childhood and for women of childbearing age as well. So those are the foods to kind of be mindful of. There are also some foods that are not recommended to give to your baby before 6 months. So if you are starting to introduce solid foods any earlier than 6 months, then these are what we call the kind of high risk allergen foods. And the current advice, unless you have been advised otherwise by a health professional, is to avoid these foods before 6 months. After 6 months, all of these foods are absolutely fine to introduce. It's just before 6 months that we want to try to avoid these ones, and that includes cow's milk products, so things like cheese or yogurts or custard. Cow's milk, it can be used from 6 months in your cooking or on breakfast cereals for your baby or something like porridge, as long as it's a full fat cow's milk. But cow's milk shouldn't be given as a main drink until your baby turns 12 months old. If your baby is younger than 6 months, the advice is to avoid it, but you can start introducing cow's milk products from 6 months onwards, just not as a main drink until they reach 1 year. Wheat or gluten, another what we call high-risk allergen food, fine to introduce after 6 months, but not before. And the same goes for nuts and seeds. So something like a smooth nut butter is a great addition to something like a baby porridge or breakfast cereal or on toast as a finger food after 6 months, but not before 6 months. Egg, fish, shellfish, celery and soy or soy products, all of those foods again are more of the high risk allergen foods, and like I say, unless you have been advised otherwise by a health professional, it's best to avoid those before 6 months. So we move on to talking about baby-led weaning or purees, and you may be familiar with the terminology baby-led weaning, and you may have read some information about it already. Baby-led weaning essentially is really just another way of describing self-feeding. So what we're doing is we're putting food in front of the baby, and they are in charge of how much of that they pick up and put to their mouth, and they can choose what they want to pick up. In the true sense of the form, with baby-led weaning, we never really put food to baby's mouth ourselves. We might show it to them, we might pick it up for them if they're struggling, but we're very much allowing them to be in control. So it's more about self-feeding than anything else. Typically, with baby-led weaning, it tends to come in the form of finger foods. And a finger food should be roughly the size of an adult index finger. So kind of that in length, so that baby can grab it with their fist, and there'll be a little bit of food poking out the top, which they can bite or they chew on. What you do want to make sure with your finger foods is that they're quite thin, so probably thinner than your finger, more kind of a flat food rather than round or a chunk. Something that's quite round and in a finger food form is more likely to be a risk of choking. So if you slice it into thinner slices and it's more of a flat finger food, then that's a better kind of shape for finger food. When you come on to, I think it's week 3 of your weaning course, there is a video about gagging versus choking, and there's a video actually of my little boy so that you can see him actually gagging on some food, so you know what that looks like. It can be quite a scary thing to witness, but the thing to remember with gagging is that baby's gag reflex is much further forward in their mouth, so it's a very protective mechanism, and it's there purposefully to protect them from choking. So actually, as long as your baby is in an upright position, got good head and neck control, and you never leave them alone with any food, and you've got your foods in a appropriate size or shape, then there's very little chance of your baby choking. But it is useful to distinguish between gagging and choking, so please do go and check out that video of what gagging actually looks like. And also in week 3 there is a really useful first aid video with a baby first aider, which talks to you again about the difference between gagging and choking, and gives you some really good demonstrations of what to do if you are worried that your baby is choking, and how to prevent, or what to do with that in the situation should it arise. So with baby-led weaning, it is very much about baby kind of being in control. It's self-feeding, they decide what goes in, and they're much more in control of that process. Like I've said, with the gag reflex, it is something that's very normal, and you'll probably all experience the gag reflex with your baby at some point. The gag reflex doesn't tend to diminish until we've sort of desensitized it. So until they are used to lumpy textures and finger foods, you will find that gag reflex is there, and purposefully for that kind of protective mechanism. So usually it's nothing to worry about, but as I say, do make sure that your baby has good head and neck control, they're seated in an upright position, and you never leave them alone with any food, and the food should always be appropriately sized and shaped. And go and check out those videos for a bit more information. With purees, so the other side to baby-led weaning is kind of the blending, and much more about the parent or the carer being in charge of feeding. So it tends to involve blending or pureeing or mashing baby's food, and then you feed your baby yourself with the spoon. So you are the one who is putting food to baby with the spoon, and usually the textures will start off smooth and then gradually become thicker and lumpier. Like I say, if you feel your baby is ready to start off with something that is much thicker and more textured right from the start, then that's a great way to start. You really want to be progressing onto thicker and lumpier textures as soon as your baby is developmentally ready, and ideally by about 7 months they should be used to some lumpy foods, and perhaps be taking some finger foods as well, even if you're not doing the baby-led weaning route. So in terms of advantages and disadvantages of baby-led weaning, some of the advantages suggest that it encourages babies to chew right from the start, and there is some observational evidence. There's not a lot of kind of really robust randomized control trials around baby-led weaning, but there is some observational evidence to suggest that babies who follow the baby-led weaning approach are less likely to be fussy when they are older. And this could be for a number of different reasons. It could be because they are used to what food looks like in its real form right from the start. It could be because they're very used to biting and chewing and swallowing food, and they haven't had to progress through more gradual stages of texture. But it also could be to do with the fact that they are the ones in control and they feel more comfortable around food because they are in control of what goes in, and they feel a little bit more independent and trusting and enjoying their food perhaps. So there's no right or wrong with baby-led weaning, really. It's not that you have to do one route or the other, and there's no crossover in between. There's no evidence to suggest that doing a mixture of the two is detrimental in any way. So for many parents, it's about perhaps trying and seeing what your baby is showing a preference towards. A lot of parents at my workshops might have a real preference towards one method or the other, but actually once they get going, baby has a really different idea and they want to do what suits them best. So actually there's no harm in just playing around with both methods and seeing what works well for your baby. It may be that you start off in those early few weeks of weaning with more of a mashed and a smooth texture and doing the feeding yourself until your baby gets a bit more familiar with what weaning is and gets familiar with lots of different flavours. And then you might find that they want to take charge a bit more, and the baby-led route might be something that you then go down after initially doing more of the purees. And that's perfectly fine. So there's no right or wrong, like I say, as to which approach you do, and you can combine or overlap the two. Sometimes with baby-led weaning, there's less need to prepare something different. You don't have to bother with the blenders or the mashers. You're almost just taking food in its real form, making sure it's an appropriate kind of texture for your baby. So with something like finger foods, even if your baby has no teeth, they should still be able to cope with a soft finger food. With something like broccoli or carrot or green beans, or courgette, you will need to steam or parboil those vegetables until they're soft enough for your baby to be able to bite through. If they've got no teeth, they need to be able to bite through it with their gums, but that's absolutely fine. Their gums will still be quite hard, and the teeth are just behind the surface of the gums. So they should be able to bite through a soft finger food with their gums. But you don't want to cook the food until it's so soft that as soon as they pick it up, it just all falls to mush in their hands and there's no longer a finger food there. So it's just getting that texture right. Something like avocado is quite a good one, or ripe pear or banana. Those kind of textures without having to cook are quite good textures for finger foods. But remember to go down more of the kind of vegetable route initially, particularly the green vegetables. So with something like broccoli or green beans or courgette, you may need to just boil or steam those vegetables first to make them soft enough. Another advantage here, because baby is very in control of how much they are taking in, there's not this kind of tendency to force feed is a strong term, but to sort of push them, this one more mouthful approach. And with babies, we want them to be very much in control of their own appetite. They know how much they need, they know how much they want in order to meet their energy requirements. So actually, if babies have this really clear communication pathway between their their gut and their brain, we want that to stay in tune for as long as possible. So we want to avoid this kind of one more mouthful approach. We want them to be in charge of their natural satiety. And if they are showing signs that they've had enough, they don't want any more, they're full up, then it's important to stop at that point. And so with something like baby-led weaning, they are very much in control of that. And if they don't want any more, they will stop. And that's usually makes them feel more comfortable and in control around meal times. Some of the disadvantages of baby-led weaning is that it can be a bit more time consuming. It obviously takes longer for a baby to chew and bite and swallow than it does just to kind of slurp some puree off the spoon. So the whole kind of mealtime process can be a little bit longer. But as long as you have time for that, that's not necessarily a bad thing, because they are getting lots of interaction and exposure to that food. Some parents say that it's difficult to make sure that they're getting enough food, that they are getting a good variety of food. You know, how do you do something like porridge or ready break or Weetabix for breakfast in a finger food form? You know, something like that is very difficult to do. However, you could still do food like that with baby-led weaning, and it's more about just letting them put their hands in it and feed themselves that way. It is difficult to know sometimes how much they are eating, because it will be very messy and you will get lots of food wastage as well. So if you prefer to know how many spoonfuls they've had, then, and you feel anxious about how much food is going in for any specific reason, whether it's growth or development or a medical issue, then perhaps baby-led weaning might be something that you come on to a little bit later. But it's a very, very individual decision. And again, if you have questions about this, please do get in touch. It will be very messy and you do get more food wastage. But again, like I was saying earlier, the mess is something to try and embrace as much as you possibly can during the weaning process, and allow them to explore and have fun with their food. Try not to clear their mouth after every mouthful. Try to let them know that food is fun and it's okay to play with our food. Table manners will come much, much later on. But for now, let them explore, let them enjoy their food. And again, this could be one of the reasons linked to being less fussy later on. So it's not a bad thing for them to get really messy with their food. This is quite a nice picture of what baby-led weaning looks like in real life. So it can get really messy, and that's kind of prime example of what it might look like. But look how happy he is. Look how much fun that looks. So just to summarise the baby-led versus purees, it's really about what works well for you. You don't have to choose one or the other and stick to that exclusively. You can combine the two approaches. And what I would say is that whatever method of weaning you choose to do, remember to go with the vegetables, particularly the green vegetables to begin with. Include plenty of variety. Make sure the meal times are enjoyable, relaxed, calm, eat together if you can. That's another good way of encouraging your baby to feel more comfortable around food and allow them to explore that food. And also to keep trying, that point about repeated exposure. Keep trying with different foods, even if they've refused it many, many times. Don't be put off trying that again at some point later on. There's a little menu planner here, and again, these are available to download, and they're also available in the slides that you can use and download it that way. And this is a little bit more to show you about the routine of weaning, just to show that it's quite a gradual process. And again, every baby will move through this sort of menu planner at different rates. It's really about doing what is right for your baby. But when you first start weaning, you were looking at 1 meal a day to begin with. Now, just for this example, I've put it at breakfast time, but you may decide that actually the midday meal or the evening meal is most appropriate for you. It doesn't really matter what time of day you introduce that first meal. What I would say is try and choose a time of day that fits in with your routine best. You want baby to be a little bit hungry, but not so hungry that they've got to the point where they're crying for food, because really all they're going to want then is milk. If they're too tired, again, they're probably not going to be interested in sitting down and playing with a new food for the very first time. So think about what fits in with their mood, their milk routine, their nap routine, and also what you've got going on that day as well. If you can, once you've decided what time of day you're going to start introducing the solid food, if you can try and stick to that time of day for the next few days, it will help to develop a bit of a routine. Baby will be familiar with what's coming next and know what to expect. So that can be helpful, but I appreciate it's not always practical to do the same time, but there or thereabouts, try and keep it roughly the same time each day. The key thing to say is, like we mentioned right back at the beginning, your food isn't about weaning off milk. So we're still carrying on with all of baby's usual milk feeds throughout the rest of the day. So you're breastfeeding on demand, or you're offering formula filled feeds on demand throughout the day. and early morning as well. We're not replacing a milk feed with our solid foods at this point. You'll see that I've emphasised the vegetables here, and this could be puree or finger foods depending on which route you're doing. So it's 1 meal a day to begin with. And then whenever you feel like your baby is ready, is showing signs that they are interested in foods, that they're going really well with it, you can move on to 2 meals a day. If you've started 1 meal a day around about 6 months, you may decide that a week or so later, you think you could try a second meal a day. And again, there's no right or wrong with what time of day you do this. It's really, again, just what fits into your routine. If you started weaning earlier than 6 months, you may be able to stay on 1 meal a day for a couple of weeks or a little longer even, and then move on to 2 meals a day. But follow baby's lead with that. Again, every baby is different. They'll all be doing something slightly different. So follow baby's lead in terms of how hungry they are and how much interest they're showing in that food. But again, you're carrying on with all baby's usual milk feeds. So you may give a little bit of your solid food and then finish off with some milk feeds here just to top them up. Make sure that they're still getting plenty of milk, and have your milk feeds spread sporadically throughout the day so that you're still milk feeding on demand as you normally would. And these solid food meals are on top of your baby's usual milk feeds at this point. And once we've done a couple of weeks of vegetable purees or vegetable finger foods, that's when we could probably start to think about some of those other food groups and get some more variety in there, and particularly focusing on things like the beans, pulses, lentils, meats, fish. All of those foods are a good source of protein and that iron that we were talking about as well. Or you could choose to do some starchy foods, some more of the kind of carbohydrate based foods. Again, there's no right or wrong, and it's really just about getting lots of variety in across the week. And then really what you're looking for is that around about 7 months, you're on to 3 meals a day. So how quickly you get there doesn't really matter. But we're looking at having 3 meals a day by around 7 months, and focusing on the variety of food groups again. And by this point, because you've probably introduced your baby to quite a lot of different foods, you might be mixing things together, and your baby might be quite well established on more sort of family meals, which might include a source of carbohydrate, some meat or fish or beans or pulses, and some vegetables as well. So for example, it could be something like a spaghetti bolognese, where you've mashed up the spaghetti and you've got some beef mince in there, and you've also got some onions or courgette or carrots and your tomato based sauce as well. So you've got a good combination of different food groups, and you simply mash or blend it to the right kind of texture for your baby. Hopefully at this stage you're moving on to much thicker and more lumpy textures, but we will come on to that as well. And again, still at this point, you are continuing to breastfeed or offer your formula feeds on demand throughout the day. So although the milk feeds aren't necessarily pictured here, simply for space more than anything, you would still be carrying on with baby's usual milk feeds at this point, and allowing them to decide how much of that they want to take. Because they're growing at quite a rapid rate at this point, it wouldn't be unusual for them to accept 3 meals a day, but still also be having plenty of their milk feeds in between the meals and early morning, early evening, and on demand. So keep that going, because a lot of their nutrition will still be coming from the breast milk or the formula milk at this age as well. And there's a few top tips here for you, just to kind of summarise those first few points of weaning. So vegetables first, starting slowly with 1 meal a day, and then moving on to 3 meals a day by around 7 months. And as I say, it doesn't really matter how quickly you get there, it's following baby's lead. Choosing whatever time of day fits best with your routine, making sure that baby is kind of interested, not too full up, but also not too hungry. In terms of how much, let baby guide you. So we were talking about that communication pathway between their gut and their brain, and babies are very in tune with how much they need in terms of energy. So it's really important to allow them just to feed to appetite. There's no evidence-based portion size guidance for infants. It's more about looking out for signs of fullness from your baby. So that might be that they are clamping their mouth shut, turning their head away, perhaps even sort of pushing the spoon away or arching their back. And all of those signs might show you that they're not interested in food. It's very normal for babies' appetite to fluctuate quite significantly as well. So don't be alarmed if one day they're eating really, really well and they might be eating quite large quantities, but a few days later their appetite will really tailors off. And that could be because they are teething, they're feeling a bit under the weather, they're perhaps not going through such a rapid growth period. But there's many different reasons why a baby's appetite could be affected. So the key thing is to have your routine where you continue to offer the food and the milk feeds, but very much let baby feed to appetite and look out for signs that they've had enough, and not push them beyond that, because that's where they can become a bit anxious or frustrated at meal times. Keep trying, eat together, smile, make eye contact, try and relax, make yummy noises. All of these things will encourage your baby to feel more comfortable and more relaxed at meal times. And remember to focus on those iron-rich foods early on in the weaning process as well. And if baby's not interested, don't worry, it's perfectly normal. Just try again the next day with something different and go back to that food again a few days later. So moving on, we are looking at working through the textures a little bit more. And as you go through your weaning course, you will receive more and more recipes for various different textures, and you'll see how the textures change as you move on through the course. What we want to do is around about 7 months, make sure that baby is getting used to much more lumpy foods, and that they're having to do a little bit more work with their mouth for this as well. So as well as changing the texture, we want to really focus on that variety. And sometimes you might hear this stage kind of referred to as stage 2 weaning, so perhaps from 7 to 9 or 10 months. It's not always important to think about weaning in terms of stages, because it can be a little bit too prescriptive. It really is more about just following your baby's lead. But do focus on making the foods lumpier and more mashed or minced, similar to those pictures there, as soon as your baby is developmentally ready or showing signs that they can cope with that kind of texture. Then do push them on through that. And focusing on the variety of food groups as well. So like I showed you in the last menu planner, getting a different variety of food groups in as you move on to 3 meals a day is a good idea, to make sure that they're getting lots of different vitamins and minerals. If you haven't started introducing finger foods, then this is a good time to do it. So around 7 months, try and focus on some finger foods, even if you haven't followed the baby-led weaning route, because that will really help to desensitize the mouth to lumps and get them used to that biting and chewing action as well. A good practice to get into as well is introducing your baby to a free flow cup or beaker. And a free flow cup or an open top cup is really useful for your baby learning that sipping action. They're obviously born to knowing how to suck, and that's a very well established technique, but they don't know how to sip. So by giving them an open top cup or a free flow beaker where the fluid flows out really freely, that's a good way for them to practice sipping rather than sucking, which is really important at this stage. And again, you're continuing with plenty of milk feeds, so follow your baby's lead on this, but it's important that they are still having plenty of milk feeds in between their meals, and perhaps early morning and evening as well before bed. They will still be getting plenty of nutrition through the milk feeds, whether it's breast milk or formula milk, so it's important to continue offering those again on demand in between their meals. Finger foods now get a little bit more adventurous compared to those first ones that I showed you earlier on. And so you can get more variety of different food groups in here, and you can get some slightly harder textures as well. So something like hard-boiled egg cut up into fingers. Butter beans can be a good finger. Once they've developed their pincer grip, then butter beans can be a good one. They're quite flat, so less of a risk of choking compared to some other beans. But do make sure they are quite flat, and you can always slice them in half. If not, they're quite a good big bean to pick up with that pincer grip. Strips of chicken, you might also do turkey or pork or beef or lamb, and they just kind of chomp on it with their gums or their teeth and really gum it down. And those ones would be a good source of iron. You could also do bread or toast fingers, pasta shapes, and this is baby pasta, it's slightly lower in salt or sodium. Breadsticks as well, you might choose to do a slightly harder one, and again, if they've got no teeth, they'll probably just suck or chomp it down with their gums initially too. And with something like your toast fingers or your breadsticks, you could use avocado or smooth peanut butter or some bean pate on the toast or bread, and also as perhaps as a dip for your breadsticks, again just for variety and for getting some more nutrients in there as well. A little bit of science, the information here about lumpy foods, and this is really the emphasis on progressing onto lumpy foods around about 7 months. And a lot of the evidence suggests that infants who were introduced to lumpy foods before 7 months or around about 7 months were perceived to eat a wider variety of foods later on compared to those who were introduced to lumpy foods a little bit later, so up until kind of 9 months. So I won't read all of this out to you, but it is in your handouts if you want to have more of a read through it. But it's really putting the emphasis on introducing lumpy foods around about 7 months or earlier if your baby is developmentally ready. So the earlier we can progress with those lumpy textures, the better. And this evidence here backs up the fact that if we can introduce lumpy foods early on, your baby is less likely to be a picky or fussy eater when they're older. So try not to hang back. Even if your baby is a bit reluctant with lumpy foods, try not to go back to the purees or the very smooth textures. We want to continue encouraging them, persevering with those lumpy textures from 7 months onwards, so that they really do get used to lumps and not going back to the purees. This is another menu planner which might be more applicable to this age group. So from 7 months onwards, you can see here that we're well established on our 3 meals a day, and the foods now are a good combination of lots of different flavors and combinations. There are some recipes included each week on your weaning course with the Lunar Hive. However, if you are interested in more recipes, I have a whole range of different weaning recipes for the different stages, so please do get in touch if you would like me to email you some more. And you'll see here that the focus is really kind of moving on to perhaps more what you might consider to be family meals. So it might not be things that are too dissimilar to what the rest of the family are eating. So there's no need really to be preparing anything different for your baby at this stage. There's no reason why they can't just have a smaller portion of your family meals that are mashed or chopped to the right texture, perhaps with a few finger foods alongside each one as well. The key thing is, if you add any salt, or if you use ready-made sauces or any kind of general seasoning that might have added salt in, that's not going to be appropriate for your baby because it will be too high in salt. So try to take baby's portion out first before you add salt to yours, or add salt to yours at the table if you have to have it on your food. You'll see here as well that we are starting to introduce perhaps a pudding at one of the meals as well. And this again will just get a little bit more energy in the form of calories and a little bit more variety in terms of the nutrients as well. So all of these puddings have something to offer in terms of their nutrient content. So it's a good way of adding some extra energy but also extra nutrients to your baby at this age, so around about 7 months. And because they're growing and developing so rapidly at this stage, that extra energy and that extra nutrients is really going to help them. Again, we are continuing to breastfeed or offer your formula feeds in between each of these meals. So you may still have an early morning, a mid-morning, mid-afternoon, and before bed milk feed at this point as well. The milk feeds still really play quite an important role in the diet. I haven't necessarily added all of the milk feeds into this menu planner just because everybody's routine is different, and also for space reasons of actually fitting it on the slide so that you can read it. But do bear in mind that it is important that they are still having plenty of their milk feeds in between these meals. And again, in terms of how much milk, there's no real answer to that. It's really individual depending on your baby, and you will again find that it varies from day to day. I would say the key thing is to offer it, and then you can allow babies to decide whether they want their milk feeds in between each of those meal times. And then moving more towards our 12 months, getting closer to that kind of 1 year milestone, which might seem like a long way off now. This is, again, just moving on a little bit. You might sometimes see this referred to as stage 3 weaning. There's not a huge difference, but you can see here again how the texture is probably less mashed or minced, but more chopped into small pieces. And we're certainly trying to aim towards more family foods at this stage. You may also find, if we move on to the menu planner, that you can introduce some snacks at this point as well. So you might have either a mid-morning snack or a mid-afternoon snack, and eventually you'll have both of those things, and this is what starts to replace some of the milk feeds at this stage. So when we start to introduce those food-based snacks at mid-morning and or at mid-afternoon, you might find that they are taking less of their milk feeds at this point, and that's fine, as long as we are getting a good variety of foods in with their meals and their snacks throughout the day. Then it is possible that they are having much less milk and maybe just a before bed, an early morning, and depending on how many snacks you're doing, they may have a little bit of milk with 1 or 2 of these. The focus again is variety, so you can see here we're really focusing on family foods. You've got some protein or iron rich foods, and you have got some carbohydrates and some fruits or vegetables, perhaps some dairy as well in each of your meal times. Again, there are some more recipes for you to download as you go through the different weeks of weaning, but if you would like some more, then please do get in touch. If your baby isn't feeding themselves at this point, then this is probably a good age to give them their own spoon or to give them their own fork, and to encourage them to do a little bit of self-feeding. And really allowing them some of that independence. Again, in terms of portion sizes, there's no guidance here, so it really is again just about allowing your baby to feed to appetite. In terms of drinks, we've talked about introducing your baby to a cup or a beaker, and ideally that should contain just water. It's a good idea to get your baby used to drinking water throughout the weaning process. Initially they won't need to drink lots of water because they're still getting so much of their fluid requirements from the milk, and also from a lot of the foods as well. They're quite wet foods and will help with hydration, so we're not expecting them to drink lots of water, but it's good practice to get them used to what water is, and also good practice to get them used to having their water in an open top cup or a free flow beaker. From 6 months, your baby can have freshly drawn tap water from the tap. If they are younger than 6 months, it's best practice is to boil that water first and allow it to cool, so that you're getting rid of any kind of bacteria or nasties in there. And there are lots of different fruit juices, baby squashes, baby teas even, that you might start to see as you peruse the baby aisles. These aren't necessary. They tend to taste very sweet, and they can be damaging for babies' teeth as they start to erupt. So I would certainly recommend getting your baby used to water as their alternative drink to milk. So milk and water are really the best drinks for them to be having, and try to avoid juices for now, because they don't really offer much extra in terms of nutrition, and they are damaging for babies' teeth. And the emphasis again of continuing with babies' usual milk feed, so breast milk or formula milk, throughout the rest of the day, and allow baby to be in charge of when they sort of start to take less milk and wean themselves more off the milk and onto solid food. For some babies you might see this earlier on, and for some babies it may not happen until they're kind of 10 or 11 months. Again, there's no right or wrong really. The crucial thing is that when they do start to wean themselves off the milk, is that they are getting enough variety through the solid food, and that they're eating enough solid food to meet their energy requirements. And if you have questions about that sort of routine, then do let me know. Like we said at the beginning, whole cow's milk, so that's full fat cow's milk, can be introduced as the main drink from 12 months. Before that, the baby's milk drink should be the breast or the formula, depending on what you're doing. But after 12 months, you can, if you want to, switch from your baby's usual milk feed to cow's milk as their drink, and by then they shouldn't be having a lot of milk to drink, because most of their nutrition is coming from the food. And we do tend to find that babies who are having, or at 12 months, if babies are still drinking lots and lots of milk, it can have an impact on their appetite for food. So that's something to bear in mind. In terms of vitamin drops, you may or may not already be giving your baby a vitamin drop. Vitamin D is recommended for infants from birth, and it's ideal for good bone and musculoskeletal health. From birth, babies are recommended to have somewhere between 8.5 and 10 micrograms of vitamin D daily, unless your baby is having formula milk. And if baby is having formula milk and they're having more than 500 mils of formula milk a day, they're getting enough from the formula milk, because the formula milk has already been fortified. So there's no need to therefore supplement on top of that. But if your baby is breastfed, then a vitamin D drop is recommended from birth. And then from 12 months, the government guidance is to offer a multivitamin, which contains not just vitamin D, but also A and C as well. And those can be in drop format that you can add to food or to drink. And there's some examples of those ones down here as well. And again, it really is just personal preference as to which multivitamin you go for. And for pregnant and breastfeeding women as well, so for the mums, if you are pregnant or if you're breastfeeding, it's recommended to take 10 micrograms of vitamin D daily throughout pregnancy and breastfeeding. But actually for the general population as a whole, we should all be taking a vitamin D supplement from October to April. So those winter months when we don't get enough vitamin D from the sunlight, everybody, including men, should be taking a vitamin D supplement of 10 micrograms a day. And that's the end of the online workshop. I hope you found it useful. It is a lot of information to take in. So please don't worry, please don't feel overwhelmed. Hopefully you can go back to this recorded video at some point and stop and start it at relevant points to you. And remember that there will be additional video clips and additional resources each week as you go through the weaning course. In terms of any questions that you have either now or as you go through the weaning process with your little one, then please do get in touch. My website is www.catherinelipnutrition.co.uk, and you are very welcome to use the contact form on there to get in touch with me, or drop me an email if you have my email address, and you can get in touch that way too, and I'll be very happy to answer your questions. And good luck. Enjoy the process.